had been planning that hiking trip for weeks. The plan was simple in my head. Take some days off work, pack up enough supplies, and hike a trail I had never done before. I wanted something that would feel new, raw, and a little challenging. I had been on plenty of hikes before, but usually on trails that were more known, ones that had regular traffic and good signs. This time, I wanted something that would feel like a real escape. I wanted the woods to feel like they swallowed me whole. I picked a place that was far enough out of town that I wouldn't run into many people. The trail I found wasn't exactly famous. I had seen a short post about it online and found a map that showed how it wound deep through the forest, climbed into hills, and looped back after several miles. The loop was longer than most trails I'd done. On paper, it looked like it would take me a full day, maybe into the night if I wasn't careful. I figured I could handle it. I had the backpack, the water, food, and some basic gear. I thought that was enough. The drive out there was quiet. The deeper I went into the back roads, the fewer houses I saw. Gas stations disappeared. For the last hour, it was just winding roads through thick trees with no cell service. When I finally reached the small gravel pull-off where the trail started, there were no other cars. The lot was big enough for maybe 5 or 6 cars, but mine was the only one. That made me feel both excited and uneasy. I wanted solitude, but standing there, seeing the empty lot and the tall trees stretching up on both sides, made me feel like I was about to step into something bigger than I understood. I checked my backpack again before heading out. I had about 3 liters of water split between bottles, a couple of sandwiches, jerky, some trail mix, a flashlight, a lighter, a thin rain jacket, and a small first aid kit. I had a compass too, though I figured I wouldn't really need it since I had printed out a map. The paper map was folded in one of the side pockets of my pack. I looked at it once more. The loop seemed straightforward. The first stretch of the trail felt easy. The dirt path was wide enough, and though leaves scattered it, you could clearly see the worn track from past hikers. Birds chirped overhead, and sunlight spilled through the trees in sharp streaks. It almost felt too peaceful. My footsteps crunched against the leaves, and with no one else around, every sound felt louder. My breathing, the snapping of twigs under my boots, even the wind moving branches above sounded amplified. For the first hour, I was enjoying it. The air felt fresh, and the deeper I went, the less I thought about work, about the noise of life back home. But eventually, the trail narrowed. Trees pressed in closer, and the ground became uneven. Roots clawed out of the soil, and I had to step carefully to avoid tripping. That was when I noticed something that stuck with me. The silence. The birds that had been chirping earlier seemed gone. I didn't hear the usual forest sounds that normally surround you. No rustling animals. No insects buzzing. It was just the sound of me moving. I brushed it off, telling myself it was just a normal shift. Forests change as you go deeper, but there was a nagging weight in my chest that kept growing. I tried to shake it, drinking some water, eating a bit of jerky, and pushing forward. The air felt a little cooler the deeper I went. The trail rose slowly, winding up into higher ground. I could see patches of rock and the sharp angles of hills in the distance through the trees. About 3 hours in, I realized I hadn't seen a single trail marker for a while. At the start, there had been some painted marks on trees, faded but visible. Then nothing. I kept following what I thought was the main path, but the further I went, the less clear it looked. The dirt path seemed broken in places, covered with leaves and branches. I had to stop, pull out my map, and check my compass. I compared the turns I had taken with the map, but it wasn't matching up cleanly anymore. The map showed a clear loop, but where I stood, the trail looked more like a spiderweb of side paths. I picked the one that looked most worn down and kept going. But the more I walked, the less confident I became that I was still on the right trail. The air had turned colder again, and now there was no sun filtering through. The trees had thickened above me, their branches forming a canopy that blocked much of the light. I pulled out my flashlight even though it was still daytime, just to make sure I could see the ground clearly. I told myself not to panic. People get turned around in the woods all the time, and as long as I stayed calm, I'd find my way back. I kept looking for signs of human presence. Broken branches, footprints, anything. But the ground was just leaves and scattered sticks. I walked faster, hoping the path would reconnect to the main loop, but after another hour, I was sure of it. I was lost. I stopped to eat one of my sandwiches and sat on a fallen log. That was when I noticed how uneasy I really felt. The quiet was heavy, like a blanket pressed over everything. I looked around and thought I saw movement in the trees far away, but when I focused, it was nothing. Probably just the wind shifting branches, but it made me tighten my grip on the flashlight. My mind started to play tricks on me. I decided to backtrack, but the trail behind me didn't look the same anymore. Every direction I turned looked identical. Trees, leaves, shadows. I forced myself to keep moving. I followed what looked like a slope heading downhill, figuring it would eventually lead to water, maybe a stream or river. People always say to follow water if you're lost, so I kept going. The downhill slope was rough. My boots slipped on loose dirt, and a few times I had to grab tree trunks to steady myself. The deeper I went, the darker it got. It wasn't night yet, but under that canopy, it felt like dusk. Finally, I heard it, a faint trickle of water. Relief washed over me, and I pushed faster until I found a narrow creek winding through the trees. I knelt beside it, splashing water on my face, drinking a little from my bottle after refilling it. The sound of the creek broke the silence, and for a moment, it calmed me. But as I stood there, I noticed prints in the mud along the edge. Not animal prints, boots. Someone had been there before me. At first, I felt relief. Maybe I wasn't so deep after all. Maybe the trail was near. But then I realized the prints weren't fresh. The edges had softened, like they'd been there for days or weeks. The light dimmed fast after that. I pulled out my flashlight fully and turned it on, holding it tight. I knew I needed to think about where to spend the night, even though I hadn't planned on it. The thought of being stuck out there overnight hadn't crossed my mind when I set out. I had no tent, no sleeping bag, just a thin rain jacket and what I was wearing. I started looking for a place to at least sit and stay off the cold ground. I found a spot near a cluster of rocks that formed a kind of alcove. I cleared leaves and sticks, sat with my back against the largest rock, and pulled my jacket tighter around me. My stomach growled, but I forced myself to ration what was left of my food. I chewed slowly, listening. Every crack of a branch, every shift in the trees made my chest tighten. I knew animals were out there. Maybe deer, maybe something bigger. I kept my flashlight beam moving, scanning the trees, half expecting to see glowing eyes staring back at me. The night felt endless. My eyelids grew heavy, but every time I dozed off, a noise snapped me awake. Once, I heard heavy movement close by, like something large stepping on dry branches. I froze, holding my breath, my flashlight aimed in the direction of the sound. Nothing came into view, but the steps didn't sound like a deer. They were slower, heavier, then silence again. When morning finally came, it wasn't sunlight that woke me but the cold. My body ached from the way I had slept, if you could call it sleep. I stood, stretched, and knew I couldn't stay put. I had to keep moving. I followed the creek again, moving slowly, looking for any sign of people, bridges, or trails crossing it. Hours passed with nothing but trees and water. My throat burned with thirst, and though I refilled my bottles, I was careful not to drink too much at once. By the afternoon, my legs felt like lead. I stumbled more than once, scraping my palms on rocks. I forced myself to keep going, telling myself there had to be something ahead. A road, a cabin, anything. I thought about the boot prints again, how old they looked. Whoever made them had been here once, so maybe I was still somewhere people came, even if not often. That evening, as the sky dimmed, I finally saw it. Through the trees, there was a faint break in the forest, a stretch where the trees thinned. I pushed toward it with every bit of strength I had left, and when I broke through, I saw what looked like a dirt road. My chest filled with relief. It wasn't paved, it wasn't wide, but it was a road. I followed it, limping, dragging my feet, until finally, I saw a cabin in the distance. It looked old, maybe even abandoned, but it was shelter. I walked up to it, tested the door, and found it unlocked. Inside, it was dusty and empty, but there was a wood stove in the corner, some old broken chairs and space. I had always loved hiking. Being out in the woods gave me a kind of peace that I couldn't find anywhere else. I liked the long stretches of trail, the sound of the wind moving through the trees, the crunch of my boots on dirt and rock, and the way the air smelled cleaner than anything back in town. I had done many hikes before, some short and easy, others that lasted for days, but one trip I decided to take a few years ago turned into something I would never forget. It was supposed to be just another trail, another challenge, but it ended up being the scariest experience of my life. It started on a late summer morning. I had packed my backpack the night before, making sure I had everything I thought I would need. I had water bottles, a water filter straw in case I needed to refill, trail mix, protein bars, jerky, a small first aid kit, a flashlight, a lighter, extra socks, and a thin rain jacket. I wasn't planning on staying overnight, but I packed like I might, just to be safe. The trail I chose was a remote one in the mountains. I had read that it was steep in parts and not well marked, but that was what drew me in. I wanted a real challenge. The drive out to the trailhead took longer than I expected. The last stretch of road was gravel and full of potholes, and my car bumped and rattled until I finally pulled into a small clearing where other hikers had parked before. There were no other cars there when I arrived. That should have been my first warning sign. Normally, even remote trails have at least one or two vehicles sitting at the start. Seeing none made me uneasy, but I pushed the thought away. I wanted to believe I had the whole mountain to myself. I set off with my pack, adjusting the straps so the weight sat evenly on my shoulders. The first mile was easy. The trail was wide, packed down by years of use, and the trees on either side swayed gently in the breeze. Birds were chirping, and the sun came through the leaves in patches of gold. I felt good. My legs were strong, and my breathing came steady. As the trail climbed, it narrowed. Rocks jutted out, and roots twisted across the ground. I had to watch every step to keep from tripping. The air grew cooler as I gained elevation, and the trees grew closer together, shutting out much of the sky. I didn't mind. I liked the feeling of being surrounded by forest. It made me feel cut off from the world, like I had stepped into a place that belonged only to me. After about 2 hours of steady hiking, I reached a ridge that gave me a view of the valley below. I stopped to rest there, dropping my pack and drinking from my water bottle. The view stretched for miles, rolling hills, distant farms, and the faint line of a river glinting in the sun. I ate a handful of trail mix and checked my map. According to it, the trail continued up toward a peak, looped around, and then dropped back down into the forest. It was supposed to be about a 12-mile loop. I figured I could handle that easily in a day if I kept moving. The trail past the ridge grew rougher. It narrowed to a faint line through thick brush. I noticed that the ground was less worn, as if fewer people came this way. The forest grew darker, with tall pines blocking the sun, and the air had that damp, earthy smell of moss and wet leaves. The silence became heavier. I didn't hear birds anymore, just the crunch of my boots and the occasional snap of a twig. I tried to shake off the feeling, but it was there, crawling up my spine. Hours passed. I kept moving forward, climbing, descending, winding through gullies and up steep switchbacks. Sweat soaked my shirt, and my legs burned, but I pressed on. I didn't notice how far I had gone until I realized I hadn't seen a trail marker in a long time. I stopped, frowning. I backtracked a little, scanning the trees for the familiar painted blazes. Nothing. I pulled out my map, but it wasn't detailed enough to match what I was seeing. The trail seemed to split into faint paths that led in different directions, none of them clear. For the first time, I felt a sharp stab of fear. Getting lost was the one thing I always tried to avoid. I took a deep breath and reminded myself not to panic. I still had daylight, water, and supplies. I decided to keep going in the direction I thought was right, hoping the trail would become clearer again. The ground sloped downward into a thick part of the forest. The air was colder here, and the trees were packed so tightly that barely any light came through. The silence pressed against me. My footsteps echoed unnaturally loud. After a while, I realized I hadn't seen anything man-made in hours. No markers, no cut logs, no signs of other hikers. The ground was covered in layers of wet leaves, and it looked like no one had walked here in years. I tried to turn back, but the trail behind me looked no different from the one ahead. Every direction seemed the same: trees, brush, shadows. My chest tightened. I tried to keep calm, but unease gnawed at me. I decided to keep moving downhill, figuring it would eventually lead me to water or a road. My boots slid on loose dirt as I descended. My legs were shaking from the strain, and sweat dripped down my neck even though the air was cool. At one point, I slipped and fell hard on my side, scraping my arm and bruising my hip. Pain flared, but I forced myself up, brushing off leaves. As the afternoon wore on, I noticed the forest growing even darker, though the sun should have still been high. I checked my watch. It was past 3. I had maybe 3 hours of daylight left. I pushed harder, moving as fast as I could, but the woods seemed endless. I crossed small streams, climbed over fallen trees, and forced my way through dense thickets. My clothes snagged on branches, and my arms and legs grew scratched. By the time the sun dropped lower, the panic I had been holding back started to claw its way in. I realized I was well and truly lost. I had no idea where I was or how far I had strayed from the trail. Every step seemed to take me deeper into nowhere. I stopped in a small clearing and dropped my pack. My heart was pounding. I drank water and tried to think. I had a flashlight, but only a few hours of battery if I used it constantly. I had food, but not enough for days. I knew I couldn't wander aimlessly all night. It was too dangerous. The ground was uneven, and a twisted ankle out here could mean the end. So I decided to set up a makeshift camp and wait until morning. I found a spot under a large pine, cleared away leaves, and sat with my back against the trunk. I ate a protein bar, even though I wasn't hungry, just to keep my energy up. The forest grew darker, shadows lengthening until they swallowed everything. Soon I couldn't see more than a few feet ahead. The night sounds began, rustling in the underbrush, the distant hoot of an owl, the creak of branches in the wind. Every sound made me flinch. I told myself it was just animals, nothing dangerous, but my nerves were stretched thin. I kept my flashlight off to save power, holding it in my hand in case I needed it. I didn't sleep much. Every time my eyes closed, I woke again at the sound of something moving nearby. Once, I swore I heard footsteps, slow and deliberate, circling in the dark. I froze, holding my breath, but when I finally flicked on the flashlight, the beam showed only trees and shadows. My mind played tricks on me, but the fear was real. When morning finally came, pale light creeping through the branches, I felt a rush of relief. I forced myself up, stiff and aching, and shouldered my pack again. My plan was simple: keep moving downhill until I found water or signs of civilization. The hours that followed were some of the hardest of my life. My legs were sore, my stomach empty, and my throat dry. The forest seemed endless, each hill leading only to another. My sense of direction was gone. I had no idea if I was making progress or just walking in circles. Then I heard it, the faint trickle of running water. I pushed toward the sound until I found a small stream winding through the trees. Relief washed over me. I refilled my bottle using the filter straw and drank deeply. I followed the stream, hoping it would lead to a larger river, and maybe from there to a road or settlement. But the stream twisted endlessly, and the terrain grew harsher. At times I had to climb over sharp rocks or wade through thick mud. My energy drained quickly. My food supply was running low. That night, I camped near the stream. Again, fear gnawed at me as I sat in the darkness. This time, the noises seemed closer. At one point, I heard a splash in the water, like something heavy stepping into it. My skin prickled, but I forced myself to stay still and quiet, clutching my flashlight but not turning it on. The sounds eventually faded, but I didn't close my eyes again. The next morning, I kept following the stream. My body felt weak, but I pushed forward, one step at a time. The forest stretched on and on. I began to wonder if I would ever find my way out. Then, sometime in the afternoon, I spotted something through the trees, a faint line that didn't look natural. My heart leapt. I pushed toward it and found an old dirt road, overgrown but still visible. Relief nearly dropped me to my knees. I stumbled onto it, following it with I had been planning the trip for months. The idea was simple in my head. I wanted to hike alone in a part of the mountains I had not explored before. I had been hiking on and off for years, and I was used to being on trails by myself. I knew the risks, but I also knew that if I prepared right, packed the right gear, and paid attention to the weather and maps, I could handle myself. The location I chose was in a more remote part of the state. It was not one of the popular parks where people walked the trails all the time. This was further out, less crowded, and not well marked. That was what drew me to it. I liked the idea of being away from crowds, away from noise, away from anything familiar. I packed my gear slowly and carefully. I checked and rechecked the things I thought I might need. I had a tent, a sleeping bag, a sleeping pad, food, a water filter, extra water bottles, extra socks, a first aid kit, a headlamp, a map, a compass, a knife, matches, and some extra layers in case it got cold. I felt ready. The hike started well. The first part of the trail went through thick trees that blocked out most of the sun. The air smelled damp and earthy. The dirt under my boots was soft from the rain that had fallen the day before. I moved at a steady pace, feeling good, enjoying the calm silence of the forest. After an hour or so, the trees started to thin, and I reached a higher ridge. The view opened up, and I could see the mountains stretching far in the distance. There were no towns, no houses, nothing but forested hills and rocky slopes. It felt both peaceful and intimidating. The plan was to follow the trail for most of the day, find a flat place to set up camp, and then hike further the next day to reach a lake that was hidden deep in the mountains. I had read that the lake was quiet, hardly visited, and very beautiful. That was the goal. By the middle of the afternoon, the sun was hot. The trail twisted and turned, sometimes climbing, sometimes dropping, sometimes disappearing into areas where the ground was rocky and hard to read. At one point, I had to stop and check the map and compass because I couldn't see any markers for a while. I didn't panic, but I felt a small ripple of unease. Losing the trail out here could mean trouble. I stayed calm, checked the compass, lined it up with the map, and eventually found the path again. I reached a spot by late afternoon where the ground leveled out. There was a small clearing surrounded by trees. The soil was flat enough for the tent. I dropped my pack, stretched my back, and set up camp. The tent went up easily. I gathered some water from a small stream nearby, filtered it, and cooked one of the freeze-dried meals I had packed. It was bland, but it was hot and it filled me up. When the sun went down, the forest became different. The sounds of birds stopped, and other noises took over. Crickets, frogs, and the occasional snap of something moving through the trees. I lay in my tent, listening. I wasn't scared at that point, but the thought of being completely alone out there began to feel heavier. There was no one around, not for miles. If something happened, I would have to deal with it myself. That thought circled in my head until I finally drifted to sleep. The next morning, I woke up early. The air was cold and damp, and mist hung between the trees. I packed my tent and gear, ate a quick breakfast bar, and continued up the trail. The climb became steeper as I moved higher. Rocks jutted out of the ground. My pack felt heavier. My legs burned with the effort, but I kept pushing forward. By midday, I reached a section of the trail that crossed a narrow ridge. On one side was a steep slope down into the forest. On the other was a wall of rock. The path itself was no more than 2 feet wide. My steps slowed, and I focused hard on where I placed my boots. A slip here could send me tumbling down a long way. The wind picked up, pushing against me as I walked. My heart pounded. I told myself to stay calm, keep my balance, and keep moving. I made it across slowly, one step at a time until the trail widened again. Relief washed through me, but I also realized how dangerous this hike could turn if I lost focus. Later in the afternoon, the sky began to change. Dark clouds rolled in from the west, and the air felt charged and heavy. I checked my map. The lake was still several miles ahead, but I wasn't sure I would reach it before the storm hit. I decided to keep moving but to look for a safe spot to set up camp again if I needed to. Not long after, the first drops of rain started falling. Then the sky opened up and the rain came hard. The trail turned slick and water poured down the slopes. I pulled on my rain jacket and tightened the hood. Thunder rumbled overhead and flashes of lightning lit the sky. I knew it wasn't safe to be on exposed ridges during lightning, so I headed down toward a lower section of forest. The rain kept coming. I was soaked even with the jacket. I found a cluster of trees where the ground was slightly higher and less muddy. I set up the tent as quickly as I could, though the rain made everything harder. The fabric stuck to itself, the poles slipped in my wet hands, and the mud clung to my knees as I tried to secure the stakes. By the time I got inside, I was dripping wet and shivering. I pulled off my soaked clothes and crawled into my sleeping bag. The storm raged outside, wind shaking the tent, rain hammering down. That was when I started to feel a real sense of fear. Not the small unease of the first night, but a heavier fear. The storm reminded me that I was exposed, vulnerable, and alone. If a tree fell, if lightning struck, if my tent ripped apart, I had nowhere to go. I lay in the dark, listening to the thunder, the endless pounding of rain, and the cracking of branches. I hardly slept. The next morning, the storm was gone, but the forest looked beaten. Branches littered the ground. The trail was washed out in some places. My boots sank into mud as I walked. The air smelled like wet soil and broken wood. I checked the map again. The lake was still ahead. I decided to push for it. The trail became harder to follow. Sections were covered with debris from the storm. Other parts had been washed downhill. At times I had to stop, backtrack, and search for where it continued. Every time I lost the trail, I felt the fear grow. I knew that in places like this, people could vanish if they stepped too far in the wrong direction. By early afternoon, I reached a section where the trail split, but the markers were gone. One path went uphill toward jagged rocks. The other dipped down into a darker valley thick with brush. I hesitated. My map wasn't clear about this split. I studied the terrain, trying to match it with the lines on the paper. I thought the uphill path was the right one, so I chose that. The climb was brutal. My legs ached, my lungs burned, and the sun beat down on me. But the higher I went, the more wrong it felt. The trail narrowed, then faded until I realized it wasn't a trail at all. Just a game path. I had gone the wrong way. I stood there, sweating and frustrated, looking down at the forest below. I had wasted hours and burned energy I couldn't afford to waste. I turned back, but when I tried to retrace my steps, I couldn't find the exact spot where I had come up. Everything looked the same. Trees, rocks, brush. Panic crept in. I forced myself to slow down, breathe, and think. I pulled out the compass, lined it with the map, and tried to reorient myself. I decided to aim toward the valley where the other path had been, hoping I could find it again. I pushed through thick brush, scratched by branches, slipping on loose soil. Every sound seemed louder now. The snap of twigs under my boots, the rustle of unseen animals, the pounding of my heart. Hours passed like this. By the time I found what looked like the trail again, the sun was already sinking low. The light dimmed, and shadows grew long. I was exhausted, hungry, and running out of water. I set up camp again in a small hollow surrounded by trees. That night, fear settled deep in me. Not because of anything supernatural, but because of the real possibility that I was lost, far from where I thought I was, and alone. I lay awake most of the night, listening to the sounds of the forest, every crack and rustle making my body tense. The next morning, I tried again. I followed the path downhill, hoping it would lead somewhere familiar or at least to water. My legs felt heavy. My shoulders ached under the weight of the pack. My stomach growled. I rationed my food carefully, knowing I didn't have much left. By midday, I reached a river. Relief hit me. Water meant life, and rivers often led to trails or roads eventually. I filtered water, drank deeply, and followed the river downstream. The ground was rough, and I had to climb over fallen logs and push through thorns, but I kept going. The river curved and twisted, leading me deeper into the forest. I saw no signs of people, no camps, no trails, just endless trees and water. Fear pressed harder. That night, I barely slept. I kept thinking about what I had been hiking for years, but nothing could have prepared me for what happened on one trip that I still think about every day. It started like any other hike, and I never thought something so normal would turn into one of the most terrifying experiences of my life. Looking back, I realize how small mistakes added up and how quickly things can get out of control in the wilderness when you are alone. It was late summer, the kind of time when the mornings are cool, the afternoons are hot, and the evenings feel heavy with silence. I wanted a long solo hike, something that would push me but still feel manageable. I had read about a trail that was about 20 miles long, winding through thick forest, up and down ridges, and ending at a small lake where some hikers camped. My plan was simple: hike the trail in one long day, then either camp at the lake or turn back depending on how I felt. I packed the usual things: water bottles, a filter, snacks, a first aid kit, a headlamp, a small tarp, a knife, and some rope. I also brought a GPS device and a paper map in case batteries died. I thought I was prepared, and in many ways I was. But being prepared on paper and being prepared in reality are two very different things. ####, the first miles. The start of the hike was calm. The trail was wide, packed dirt with rocks scattered across it. I walked through tall trees that blocked out most of the sun, and the air was damp and earthy. Birds chirped overhead, and I could hear the sound of squirrels moving through the underbrush. For the first couple of miles, everything felt normal. I moved at a steady pace, drinking water every so often and checking my map against the GPS. I was careful about my direction. I always liked to stay aware of my location because I knew how easy it was to get lost, even for experienced hikers. The trail slowly narrowed as I went deeper into the forest. The trees grew closer together, and fallen branches crossed parts of the path. Some areas were muddy, and I had to watch my footing. I noticed old boot prints here and there, proof that others had passed through, though they looked faded and probably days old. I kept going for hours. The forest shifted around me as the sun rose higher. The air warmed, and bugs came out. I swatted at mosquitoes and gnats, wiping sweat from my forehead. At one point, I crossed a small stream, hopping over rocks slick with moss. I filled one of my bottles there with filtered water, crouching low and listening to the steady sound of the current. The first signs of trouble earlier. The trail markers, which were painted blazes on trees, became harder to spot. At first, they appeared every few minutes, a bright stripe on a trunk that reassured me I was on the right path. But as I went further, the marks were more spread out. Some were faded, some hidden behind branches. I told myself it was fine. I had my GPS and it showed the trail line clearly. But the deeper I went, the less accurate it seemed. The line showed me close to the trail, but sometimes the ground in front of me didn't look like much of a trail at all. Just patches of dirt and rocks, with grass starting to grow over them. Still, I pushed on. I wanted to reach the lake, and I didn't want to admit I might already be getting turned around. I convinced myself I was fine. #### losing the trail. By midday, the forest grew thicker, the trees taller and darker. The trail sloped uphill, and I climbed steadily, sweat soaking my shirt. I stopped once to eat a protein bar, sitting on a log and catching my breath. Everything was still around me, except for the faint rustle of leaves in the breeze. When I started again, I realized the trail was barely visible. I moved slowly, scanning the trees for blazes. I found one, faint and old-looking, but nothing after that. I tried following the direction I thought the trail should go, but after a few minutes, I found myself walking through ferns and brush that didn't look trampled at all. I checked the GPS. It showed I was close to the line, but it didn't match what I saw on the ground. I took out my paper map, but the forest around me looked like an endless pattern of ridges and gullies, hard to match with the lines on the map. I felt my chest tighten. Getting lost wasn't in the plan, and I hated the thought of turning back. I decided to keep moving forward, thinking the trail would show up again if I just kept going in the same direction. But the more I walked, the worse it got. The ground dipped into a ravine full of fallen logs. I climbed down carefully, scraping my hands and legs on branches. At the bottom, I followed what looked like an animal path, but it twisted in the wrong direction. When I climbed back out, I couldn't tell which way I had come from. That was when I realized I was officially lost. The first wave of panic was sharp and fast. My breathing quickened, and my thoughts scattered. I turned in circles, trying to see something familiar, but every direction looked the same. Trees, brush, shadows. I forced myself to stop and sit on a rock. I drank water, trying to calm down. I knew panicking would only make things worse. I told myself I had gear, I had daylight, and I just needed to think. I looked at the GPS again, trying to line it up with my compass. I decided to keep moving east, thinking I would eventually reconnect with the main trail. I walked carefully, marking trees with small cuts from my knife so I could trace my steps if needed. The forest grew denser, the ground uneven with rocks and roots. I stumbled often, catching myself on branches. Hours passed like this, and I started to realize I wasn't finding the trail again. The sun shifted, and the light began to change. It was later than I thought. My stomach growled, and I ate another bar, but the food sat heavy in my stomach. My throat was dry, and even though I still had water, I felt a deep thirst that made me want to ration it. #### night in the woods. When the sun finally dipped low, I knew I couldn't keep moving. The forest darkened quickly, and soon I could barely see my own hands. I used my headlamp, but the narrow beam only lit a small circle. Everything beyond it felt alive, the shadows moving when I blinked. I found a small clearing near a cluster of rocks and decided to set up there. I tied my tarp between two trees as best as I could and sat beneath it, knees pulled to my chest. The air grew colder, and every sound felt amplified. Crickets chirped, branches cracked, and something moved through the underbrush far away. Sleep came in short, broken stretches. I woke often, heart racing, sure that something was watching me, but every time it was just the empty forest. Still, I never shook the feeling that I wasn't alone. At dawn, I packed up and started moving again. I was tired, sore, and more determined to find my way out. I picked a direction and stuck to it, checking my compass every few minutes. By mid-morning, I stumbled across an old, overgrown trail. Relief washed over me. It looked faint and unused, but it was still a path. I followed it for hours, thinking it would lead me back to the main trail or a road. But the path only grew narrower until it disappeared entirely into brush. I was back in the same situation, only deeper in. My water was running low, and the heat was worse than the day before. My legs ached, and my feet burned with blisters. #### signs of others. Late that afternoon, I noticed something strange. An old fire ring made of rocks. Ashes filled the center, long cold. My heart raced. Someone had camped there once, maybe not too long ago. I searched the area and found faint signs of footprints, though they were smudged and unclear. I followed them, hope driving me forward, but they faded quickly into the forest. That night, I slept poorly again. Hunger gnawed at me, and I shivered under my tarp, listening to the endless sounds of the forest. By the third day, I was weak and desperate. I drank the last of my water that morning, knowing I would need to find more soon. My lips were cracked, and my tongue felt thick in my mouth. I forced myself to keep moving east, climbing over ridges, sliding down slopes, stumbling across rocks. Hours blurred together. My head spun and my body felt heavy. Finally, as the sun dipped low again, I heard something I hadn't heard in days. The faint hum of cars. My heart leapt. I pushed forward, crashing through brush, ignoring the pain in my legs. The sound grew louder until I saw a break in the trees ahead. I staggered out of the forest and onto a narrow road. Asphalt stretched out in both directions, empty but real. I collapsed on the shoulder, tears burning my eyes. I had made it out. A car eventually came, and I flagged it down with the last of my strength. The driver, a man heading home from work, stopped and stared at me in shock before helping me inside. I was taken into town, given water, food, and a ride back to where I had parked days before. The whole ordeal had lasted 3 days. 3 days of being lost, hungry, thirsty, and terrified. I learned just how quickly things can go wrong, even for someone who thought they were ready. Now, whenever I hike, I carry extra supplies. I mark my route more carefully. I had been looking forward to that hike for weeks. It was supposed to be a simple overnight trip into the mountains, nothing too crazy, just one of those quiet hikes where you carry what you need, follow a trail, and camp out under the trees. I had done similar hikes before, and I felt confident in my ability to handle myself out there. I had a good backpack, decent gear, enough food and water for 2 days, and a plan to follow the trail up to a ridge where there were some clearings good enough for a small tent. The weather had been steady all week, clear skies with mild temperatures, and the forecast called for nothing worse than a light breeze at night. Everything about the trip seemed straightforward when I left my car at the trailhead. The trail started off simple. The first stretch wound through tall pines and spruce, the air sharp with the smell of resin and damp needles. The ground was mostly dry, though patches of mud lingered where water had pooled after a rain earlier that week. I fell into a steady rhythm of walking, adjusting the straps of my pack until they rested comfortably, listening to the crunch of dirt and gravel under my boots. Birds called from high in the canopy. At one point, I saw a deer bound through the brush ahead, its white tail flicking before it vanished into the trees. I checked my map against the landmarks and the signs. The trail was supposed to split about 4 miles in, with one branch leading up toward the ridge and another dropping down toward a river. I planned to take the ridge, since it was the quieter and less popular route. I liked the idea of being away from people for a night, just me and the woods with no one else around. The first few hours passed without a problem. The forest thickened, the trees crowding closer together, and the sunlight came down in narrow beams through the branches. The air cooled the higher I climbed. I stopped once to drink water and eat a handful of trail mix, then pushed on. I felt strong and steady, and I thought about how nice it would be to set up camp later, cook a simple meal, and sit listening to the wind moving through the treetops. But I never reached the split in the trail where I was supposed to turn. Instead, somewhere along the way, I missed it. At first, I didn't realize it. The trail I was following narrowed and became less obvious, but I assumed that was just the ridge trail being less traveled. The ground had more roots, more uneven patches where erosion had eaten at the dirt, and I had to watch my footing. I didn't think much of it. The map had said the ridge trail wasn't as well maintained, so it seemed normal. By the time I started wondering if something was off, I had already gone far enough that turning back felt like a waste. The trail still looked like a trail. It curved upward, steady and rough, with faint signs of boot prints in the dirt. I told myself it was fine. I would keep following it. Eventually, it would either open up near the ridge or reconnect with another main trail. But the farther I went, the worse the path became. Sections vanished into rocks, and I had to look closely for where it continued. In places, downed branches blocked the way. The slope grew steeper, and I had to use my hands sometimes to steady myself against roots or trunks. By then, I had the uneasy feeling I wasn't on any official trail at all, but more of a game path or an old logging road that had half disappeared. I stopped to check my map again, standing there with it unfolded against my knee, trying to line up the ridges I could see through the trees. The problem was the map wasn't detailed enough to show every dip and rise. I couldn't tell exactly where I was. I had the rough idea that the ridge should be above me, but the path I had been following seemed to be pulling me in a different direction, sideways instead of upward. I debated turning back right then, but it was already late afternoon. The sun had shifted and shadows stretched long across the ground. If I backtracked, I wasn't even sure I would find the exact place where I had gone wrong. The thought of retracing steps in fading light unsettled me more than pushing forward. At least ahead of me, I had a direction. If I turned back, I risked circling or losing the faint track altogether. So I kept climbing. The forest grew quieter as the evening settled. Birdsong faded, and the air cooled noticeably. I still hadn't found a good place to stop for the night, but I told myself once I found a relatively flat clearing, I would set up camp even if it wasn't at the ridge. I didn't want to push too far into darkness. That was when I realized how much trouble I had gotten myself into. The trail simply stopped. One minute I was following a thin but clear route through the trees, and the next it spilled into a patch of tangled undergrowth and vanished. I stood there scanning in every direction, looking for where it continued, but nothing showed. It was just brush and brambles and slopes. No worn dirt, no footprints, no sign anyone had passed through recently. The silence pressed in. The only sound was my own breathing and the faint whisper of wind through the branches overhead. I felt a knot of panic in my stomach. I forced myself to stay calm, to breathe slowly, to think it through. I wasn't lost completely. I still knew the general direction of the ridge and the way I had come. I had food, water, and gear. The worst-case scenario, I told myself, was camping overnight here and figuring it out in the morning with better light. But the spot I stood in wasn't good for camping. The ground sloped, the undergrowth was thick, and fallen branches crowded the space. I had to push forward a little farther to find a decent place. The light dimmed quickly as I searched. Shadows swallowed the spaces between trees, and the forest turned from green to gray. I moved carefully, pushing through brush, scanning for an open patch of ground. I stumbled once over a root, catching myself on my hands, and felt a sting where the skin scraped. My palms burned as I brushed dirt away. Finally, I found a small clearing between trees where the ground was relatively flat. It wasn't ideal, but it would do. I shrugged off my pack, pulled out the tent, and set it up as quickly as I could in the fading light. The motions were familiar, almost automatic, and I was glad for that. It kept me from focusing on the unease that gnawed at the back of my mind. By the time the tent was up and my sleeping bag unrolled inside, the forest was nearly dark. I boiled water on my small stove, ate a simple meal of noodles, and sat there listening to the sounds of night rising around me. Crickets chirped from the grass, and somewhere far off, an owl called. Otherwise, it was still, too still. I zipped into my tent, laid back, and tried to rest. Sleep didn't come easily. Every crack of a twig outside made my eyes snap open. I imagined animals moving close, maybe deer or raccoons, maybe something bigger. I told myself it was normal forest noise, nothing unusual. Still, my body stayed tense, my ears straining to catch every sound. At some point, exhaustion won and I drifted off. When I woke, it was still dark, but something had pulled me from sleep. My heart pounded as I lay there, staring into the black of the tent. Then I heard it again, a sound outside. Not a twig snapping this time, but footsteps. Slow, deliberate crunches in the undergrowth. I froze, barely breathing. The sound moved past my tent. Not too close, but near enough that I was certain it wasn't just the forest shifting. The rhythm of it was wrong for an animal. It was too steady, too much like a person walking carefully in the dark. I waited, every muscle rigid, listening as the steps faded into the distance. For the rest of that night, I didn't sleep. The first light, I packed up quickly. I wanted out of that spot as fast as possible. I didn't even cook breakfast, just stuffed food into my pocket to eat while walking. The forest looked different in the morning, washed pale by mist, but I still couldn't find a clear trail. I chose a direction that I thought would take me upward toward the ridge. It was rough going. I had to climb over rocks and push through brush, stopping often to catch my breath. Hours passed, and I still had no sense of where I was. The terrain twisted, slopes dropping where I didn't expect them, gullies cutting across my path. By midday, I admitted to myself that I was lost. Not just a little off trail, but truly lost. I forced myself to think rationally. I still had food and water, though not unlimited. My best chance was to keep moving until I found a stream or river, then follow it downward. Waterways usually led to roads or settlements eventually. That was the rule. So I aimed downhill, pushing through thick forest, tripping over roots, scraping my arms on branches. Hours blurred together. The sun drifted lower. My legs burned with fatigue. My throat ached from thirst, though I rationed my water carefully. At last, I heard it, the faint rush of water. Relief surged through me. I scrambled toward the sound until I reached a narrow stream trickling between rocks. I knelt and splashed water on my face, then filled my bottle and filtered what I could. The cold water steadied me. I decided to follow the stream. It twisted and turned, sometimes vanishing under brush before resurfacing. The ground along it was uneven, slippery with moss, but it gave me a direction. That night I camped near the stream. Again, unease pressed in as I lay in my tent. Again, I had always liked hiking alone. Something about the quiet, the rhythm of walking, and the feeling of being cut off from everything gave me a sense of peace I couldn't find anywhere else. But the hike I took that autumn, deep into a section of national forest that I didn't know well, turned out to be the single most terrifying experience of my life. It's something I still think about every time I lace up my boots. The trail I picked wasn't even marked on most maps. I'd read about it in a small online forum where people shared forgotten paths and hidden routes. They said it was overgrown in places, barely used, and not easy to follow, but that it led through some of the most remote sections of forest left in that state. That was exactly what I was looking for. I wanted real isolation. I wanted to be away from crowds, away from people, away from any sign of the modern world. I packed enough food and water for 2 days, my tent, my sleeping bag, a small stove, and a printed map that I had drawn from what little information I'd gathered. The start of the trail was hard to find. I parked my car on a dirt pull-off along an unpaved road. From there, I had to cut through tall grass and brush until I found the faint path. It was nothing more than a worn line through the undergrowth. The trees pressed close together, their branches tangled, and the ground was uneven with roots and fallen logs. I liked it immediately. The first couple of hours passed without anything unusual. The trail was hard to follow at times, but I paid attention to landmarks and checked my compass often. I carried a GPS, but I had promised myself I'd only use it if I absolutely had to. The forest was thick, the air cool, and the sound of leaves crunching under my boots was the only thing breaking the silence. I stopped once to eat a snack and drink some water. Sitting on a log, I realized how quiet it was. No distant cars, no voices, no sounds of civilization at all. Just the faint creak of branches moving in the breeze and an occasional bird call. That kind of silence always made me feel small, like the forest could swallow me up and nobody would ever know. As I continued deeper, the trail became harder to see. In some places, it disappeared completely under fallen leaves. I'd stop, look around, and eventually find the faint line again. It slowed me down, but I didn't care. I wasn't in a rush. I just wanted the experience. By late afternoon, I started looking for a place to set up camp. The ground was uneven in most spots, and the trees were too close together, but eventually, I found a small clearing. The grass was flattened in one corner, as if an animal had laid there, but it looked like a good spot. I set up my tent, cooked some noodles on my little stove, and ate as the light faded. When night fell, the darkness was absolute. Even with a headlamp, the forest around me seemed endless. The beam of light showed only tree trunks and undergrowth, and beyond that, blackness. I lay in my sleeping bag, listening. I heard the distant crack of branches a few times, maybe a deer moving through, maybe something else. I reminded myself that animals were normal. I was deep in their home after all. Sleep didn't come easily. Every noise put me on edge. The tent felt thin, flimsy, useless against whatever was out there. At one point, I heard a sound like footsteps crunching leaves. Slow, steady, deliberate. My breath caught. I held still, straining my ears. After a minute, the sound stopped. I told myself it was probably just an animal again. Eventually, exhaustion won, and I drifted off. The next morning, I packed up and pushed deeper into the forest. The trail was even harder to see now. Sometimes I wondered if I was even on it anymore, but I trusted my compass and the direction I had planned. The forest grew thicker, darker, the trees taller and older. I started to feel the weight of the isolation. It was like I had entered a place that people weren't supposed to go. Around midday, I came across something that froze me in place. It was a campsite, not an old one, Not a fire ring from years ago, but a fresh one. There was a tarp strung between two trees, a small pile of wood stacked neatly, and a backpack leaning against a stump. I stood there, staring, my heart pounding. I hadn't seen another person since I left my car. This trail wasn't supposed to be used by anyone. I called out, but no one answered. The campsite looked empty, but it was too neat, too organized to be abandoned. I walked closer, cautiously. The backpack looked worn but intact. The tarp was stretched tight, no leaves on it, which meant it had been set up recently. I saw boot prints in the dirt. My chest tightened. I backed away, deciding not to touch anything. Whoever was staying here might just be out collecting water or firewood. I didn't want to be caught snooping. I moved quickly back to the trail and kept going. But the whole time, I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was nearby, maybe even watching. By late afternoon, I realized I was lost. The trail had vanished completely. I checked my compass, but the forest looked the same in every direction. I pulled out my map, but it didn't help. Panic started to rise in me, but I forced it down. I could use my GPS, but part of me resisted. I didn't want to admit I was already that far gone. I kept walking, trying to find the trail again, but the ground grew rougher. Hills rose and fell, gullies cut through the earth, and thick brush slowed me down. I tripped more than once, scraping my hands on rocks. Sweat soaked my shirt even though the air was cool. As evening approached, I knew I had to set up camp again. I found a spot between two trees and pitched my tent quickly. My nerves were on edge. I kept thinking about that other campsite. I hadn't heard or seen anyone, but the memory of it nagged at me. I ate a little food, too anxious to enjoy it, and crawled into my sleeping bag. That night was worse. I lay awake, listening. Around midnight, I heard it again. The sound of footsteps in the leaves. Not a deer, not a raccoon. These were slow, measured steps. I held my breath, heart hammering. The steps came closer, circling my tent. My hands trembled as I gripped the handle of my knife. The steps stopped. I waited, every muscle tense. After what felt like hours, I heard them again, moving away into the trees. I didn't sleep at all. When the sky finally lightened, I crawled out of the tent. There were footprints in the dirt around my campsite. Human footprints. My stomach dropped. Someone had walked around my tent in the night. At that point, I didn't care about maps or compasses or pride. I pulled out my GPS and turned it on. The screen showed me how far I was from where I had parked. The problem was that the straight line back cut through miles of dense forest with no trail. Still, I didn't see another option. I started moving fast, too fast. Branches tore at my clothes, roots caught my boots, and sweat stung my eyes. I checked the GPS every few minutes, making sure I was still heading the right way. Every sound behind me made me whip around, but I never saw anyone. Hours passed. My legs ached, my throat was dry, and my pack felt heavier with each step. At one point, I stumbled into a ravine and had to climb out, scraping my knees bloody. I kept going, driven by fear. In the late afternoon, I reached another clearing. At first, I thought it was a good place to rest, but then I froze again. There was another campsite. This one wasn't neat. It looked abandoned, but not in a natural way. The tent was collapsed, torn in places. A sleeping bag lay half unrolled, dirty and damp. There were clothes scattered on the ground, a boot half buried in leaves. I felt sick. I didn't go closer. Something about it felt wrong, like whoever had stayed there had left in a hurry or been forced to leave. I turned and pushed on. The sun dropped lower, and I knew I wouldn't make it out before dark. My GPS showed I was still miles from the road. My legs were shaking, my chest tight with exhaustion, but I couldn't stop, not after what I had seen. As the light faded, I stumbled across something that made my blood run cold. Another set of footprints. They weren't mine. They were fresh, pressed into the soft earth, heading the same direction I was. Someone was ahead of me, moving toward the road. I didn't know what to do. If I followed them, I risked catching up, and I didn't want to meet whoever left those prints. If I went another way, I might get even more lost. In the end, I kept going, my eyes darting constantly to the trees. Darkness fell completely, and I had no choice but to set up camp again. I didn't dare light a fire. I pitched my tent quickly, crawled inside, and sat with my knife in my lap, listening. The forest was alive with sounds. Crickets, owls, the rustle of leaves. But underneath it, I swore I could hear faint movement. A snap of a twig, a brush of leaves. My skin crawled. I barely blinked all night. When morning came, I packed up and pushed on with everything I had left. My body ached. My feet blistered. But the thought of getting out kept me moving. I had planned the hike for weeks, but nothing about how it unfolded felt like what I imagined. I thought it would be challenging, maybe even exhausting, but I didn't expect it to turn into one of the most terrifying experiences of my life. I still think about it often, the way everything looked, the way everything sounded, the way I felt when I realized just how much trouble I was in. The trail was called the Ridge Trail, and it ran along the spine of a mountain range that wasn't especially famous but still attracted people who liked the quiet kind of hiking. It was the kind of place where you might go an entire day without seeing another person. That was part of the reason I chose it. I thought the solitude would be good for me, a break from the constant noise of life. I set out early in the morning with a pack that felt heavier than I wanted it to be. I had stuffed it with all the essentials: water, food, extra clothes, a map, compass, and a small emergency kit. I also had a small tent rolled up, though I didn't plan on needing it since I thought I could finish the hike before nightfall. Still, I packed it because I always felt uneasy not having a backup plan. The air was cool at first, the kind of cool that makes your skin feel awake. I could see my breath when I started, though the sun was already pushing its way above the trees. The first part of the trail wound through a dense forest where the ground was soft with pine needles. Every step made a muted crunching sound. The air smelled sharp, clean, mixed with that earthy smell that comes from damp soil. I remember how still it felt, the only movement being the occasional flicker of a bird darting between branches. After about an hour, the trail started to climb. The trees grew thinner, and the ground turned rocky. My legs burned with the incline, but I liked the feeling. It made me feel like I was pushing myself, like the day was going exactly how I wanted. The higher I climbed, the more I could see through breaks in the trees, rolling hills stretching out into the distance, their tops still hidden in morning mist. By mid-morning, I was sweating heavily. I stopped to drink water and checked the map. The ridge was still a long way off, but I figured I was making good time. The trail looked straightforward. The only thing I noted was that it grew narrower along the ridge itself, with steep drop-offs on either side. That didn't bother me much at the time. I pressed on, moving steadily upward. The forest eventually gave way to more open ground. Low shrubs replaced tall pines, and the sun beat down harder with fewer branches overhead to soften it. The sound of wind became louder, brushing across the exposed slope. By now, my legs were sore, but I told myself that was part of the point. When I finally reached the ridge, the view was staggering. Both sides fell away sharply, the valley far below. The trail was just wide enough for one person to walk comfortably, though in some spots it narrowed until I had to carefully place each step. Loose rocks shifted underfoot in certain places, and I had to steady myself against the ground with my hand once or twice. First, it was beautiful. I stopped several times to take it all in. The valleys, the endless green, the silence broken only by wind and the occasional bird. It was the kind of silence that almost hummed in your ears because it was so total. But after a while, the beauty began to mix with unease. The narrowness of the ridge, the sheer drops on both sides, the way the wind pushed at me like it was trying to move me sideways. It all began to weigh on me. My steps slowed. My heart beat harder, not just from exertion but from a rising tension in my chest. That was when I first realized just how alone I really was. I had been looking forward to that hike for weeks. I had gone hiking before plenty of times, but never anything that really tested me. Most of my hikes had been on well-marked trails close to home, where people were always passing by and cell service was never too far away. This time, I wanted something different. I wanted to be alone, away from all the noise of the city, and push myself on something more remote. I had read about a long trail system that stretched through miles of forest and hills, with parts of it barely maintained. It was not the kind of trail you'd find families or casual walkers on. Most people who went there were either experienced backpackers or locals who knew the land well. That was what I wanted. A test. I packed my gear carefully. I had a decent backpack with enough space for food, water, a small tent, a sleeping bag, a map, a compass, and extra clothes. I packed more food than I thought I'd need, mostly energy bars, trail mix, jerky, and a few ready-made meals. I brought 2 liters of water and a filter straw so I could drink from streams if I needed to. I packed a flashlight, a knife, and a first aid kit. Everything felt planned out, but I also felt a nervous excitement I hadn't felt before. This wasn't just a stroll in the park. The morning of the hike was cool, with a light fog hanging in the air as I drove out to the trailhead. The road became narrower the farther I went, until it turned into gravel. My car bounced on the uneven surface. When I finally reached the small dirt lot, there was only one other car parked there. The place felt deserted, quiet in a way that made the air heavy. I stepped out, stretched, and started to get my gear ready. The trailhead was marked by a simple wooden post with faded paint. The sign warned hikers that sections of the trail were unmaintained and to proceed at their own risk. I felt a small chill when I read that, but I shook it off. I was prepared. I adjusted the straps of my pack, tightened my boots, and started walking. The first part of the trail was calm. Birds chirped in the distance, and I could hear the soft trickle of water somewhere beyond the trees. The path was easy to follow, packed dirt with patches of roots and stones. My legs felt strong, and my mind was clear. I liked the rhythm of walking, the steady sound of my boots crunching against the ground. For the first hour, it felt like exactly what I needed. As I got deeper into the forest, the trail became narrower. Branches leaned over the path, and the ground grew uneven. I had to watch my step to avoid slipping. The air felt cooler, and the light dimmed as the trees thickened overhead. I pulled out my map during a short break and tried to match the bends of the trail with the lines on the paper. Everything seemed to match. I was still on track. A couple hours in, I came across a small creek. The water moved slowly, clear enough to see the smooth stones on the bottom. I crouched down and splashed some on my face. It was cold, refreshing, and it woke me up. I refilled one of my bottles using the filter straw, drank until I felt full, and kept going. The trail continued uphill, winding back and forth. My breathing grew heavier, and sweat began to stick to my shirt. The forest seemed quieter now. I noticed how the bird sounds had faded, leaving only the crunch of my boots and the sound of my breath. Every once in a while, I thought I heard something behind me, like a faint snap of a twig, but whenever I turned, there was nothing there. By the time noon rolled around, I was deep into the hills. The trail markings had grown scarce, just occasional blazes on trees that looked faded and old. Some were barely visible at all. I checked my map again, tracing with my finger where I thought I was. The trail seemed to split in 2 directions, one heading east and the other continuing north. The map wasn't clear, and the markings on the trees didn't help. I picked the path that looked more worn, thinking it must be the right one. It didn't take long before I realized the path was becoming harder to follow. The ground looked less like a trail and more like just flattened brush. I hesitated, but kept going, telling myself it would reconnect with the main trail. The deeper I went, the less it looked like a trail at all. Branches scraped against my arms, and I had to step over fallen logs and push through thick brush. I pulled out the map again, but I couldn't figure out exactly where I was anymore. I tried using the compass, but even then, the lines on the map didn't seem to make sense with what I was seeing. I decided to keep moving in what I thought was the same direction as before. I told myself I'd eventually cross back onto the real trail. Hours passed, and it didn't happen. I realized I had made a mistake. I stopped walking and listened. The forest was still and heavy, not even the sound of wind moving through the trees. My stomach felt tight as the thought finally sank in. I was lost. I tried not to panic. I told myself I just needed to backtrack. I turned around and tried to retrace my steps. At first, I recognized some of the places I had just passed. But after a while, everything started to look the same. Trees, rocks, brush. It all blended together. I walked faster, trying to find something familiar, but the more I looked, the less I recognized. The light began to change, dimming as the sun sank lower in the sky. My legs ached, and my throat felt dry. I stopped near a cluster of rocks, dropped my pack, and sat down. I forced myself to eat a bar of trail mix and drink some water. My heart was racing, and my hands shook a little as I ate. When the light finally started to fade, I knew I couldn't keep moving. I had to make camp. I found a flat spot near a large tree and cleared away sticks and stones. I set up my tent quickly, trying to ignore the sinking feeling in my chest. The forest around me felt darker than usual, pressing in close. I crawled into my sleeping bag, zipped the tent shut, and lay still. Couldn't sleep. Every sound outside made my chest tighten. I could hear cracks and snaps in the distance, and once, something heavy moving through the brush. My imagination ran wild, picturing a bear, a cougar, or someone else out there. I gripped the knife I had brought with me, even though I knew it wouldn't do much if something big came close. I must have dozed off at some point, because when I opened my eyes again, it was still dark but quieter. My body ached from the hard ground, and my throat was dry. I drank some water and forced myself to stay calm. I told myself morning would come soon, and I'd figure things out then. When the first light appeared, I packed up quickly and started walking again. I tried to keep moving in one steady direction, using the compass to guide me. My goal was to find a stream or river. Water usually led to roads or at least back towards civilization. I pushed through brush, my arms scratched and sore, until finally I heard it, a faint trickle. I moved toward the sound and found a narrow stream running downhill. Relief washed over me, and I crouched down to drink. I filled my bottles again and decided to follow the stream. It was hard walking, with slick rocks and uneven ground, but I kept going. The hours dragged on. My legs burned, and my feet felt blistered. The forest seemed endless. I found no signs of people, no bridges, no trails, just water, trees, and rocks. I felt smaller and smaller as the day wore on. By late afternoon, the sky began to change. Clouds rolled in, thick and gray. Soon the first drops of rain fell, cool against my skin. I pulled on a rain jacket, but it didn't help much once the rain turned heavier. The ground became slick, and I slipped several times, once hard enough to scrape my knee on a rock. Blood trickled down my leg, mixing with the rain. I limped along, my pack heavier with each step. I felt a rising panic again, a sense that I was sinking deeper into something I couldn't escape. My chest tightened, and I had to stop and force myself to breathe slowly. The rain finally slowed as night came again. I set up camp near the stream, too exhausted to eat much. I chewed on some jerky, drank more water, and lay in my tent, staring at the thin fabric above me. My body ached in every joint, and my thoughts felt foggy. I realized how badly I had underestimated the hike. The next morning, I decided to keep following the stream. I told myself it had to lead somewhere eventually. My clothes were still damp, and I felt chilled as I walked. My stomach growled constantly, and even though I still had food, it didn't feel like enough. Every bite felt smaller, every sip of water less satisfying. Hours later, I stumbled upon something that made my heart jump. It was an old, broken wooden bridge stretched across the stream. The planks were rotted, and some had fallen into the water, but it was man-made. That meant people had been here at some point. I felt a surge of energy as I crossed to the other side and searched the area. Not far from the bridge, I found a faint path. It wasn't much, just a line of flattened brush and disturbed earth, but it was something. I followed it, my legs shaking with exhaustion but fueled by the hope that it would lead somewhere. The path twisted and turned, sometimes fading completely before I had planned the hike for weeks. It was supposed to be a challenge, but not something impossible. I wanted to push myself to test how far I could go alone in the wilderness. I had studied the map, traced the trail with my finger again and again, and marked the points where I thought I would rest, refill my water, and maybe camp overnight if I needed to. The trail was part of an old logging road that wound up the side of a mountain range, branching into smaller game trails and ending high on a ridge where the view stretched out over miles of dense forest. People said the climb was long and tiring, but doable if you started early and kept a steady pace. I packed carefully. My backpack held a sleeping bag, a small tent, extra clothes, food for 2 days, water bottles, a filter straw, a knife, and a headlamp with spare batteries. I wore sturdy boots that I had broken in over the last year and carried trekking poles to help with the steep ground. I felt prepared, maybe even a little too confident. The morning of the hike, I started at dawn. The air was cool and heavy with the smell of pine. My boots crunched on the gravel at the start of the trailhead. The forest was still dark, but thin light filtered in through the trees. It felt quiet, the kind of silence that made every small sound stand out. The rustle of branches, the flap of a bird's wings, the distant rush of water somewhere deeper in the woods. The first miles were easy. The trail followed a wide, clear path with old-wheel ruts from the days when trucks hauled timber down from the slopes. Ferns grew thick along the sides, and the air smelled damp and earthy. I kept a good pace, my legs fresh and my pack still sitting comfortably on my shoulders. Hours passed, and the sun climbed higher. The trail began to narrow and climb more steeply. Rocks jutted out, and roots tangled across the dirt. Sweat ran down my back, and I stopped often to sip water. At one point, I turned and looked back down through the trees. I could see the faint line of the road I had driven in on far below, already looking small. The world felt bigger here, heavier, like I had stepped into a place that didn't care whether I was there or not. By mid-afternoon, I had been hiking for nearly 7 hours. I had expected to be close to the ridge by then, but the trail stretched on longer than I thought. The switchbacks wound endlessly upward. My legs burned, and my shoulders ached from the weight of the pack. I kept telling myself that once I reached the ridge, I would rest, eat, and decide if I wanted to push down the far side or set up camp for the night. The trail changed again. It grew faint, less used. Grass and brush crowded it, and in places I had to stop and look around to be sure I was still on the right path. I pulled out my map and compass, checked my bearings, and reassured myself I was going the right way. The forest grew denser. The light dimmed even though the sun was still high. Every sound seemed sharper. A squirrel running through the leaves startled me more than it should have. My nerves felt stretched thin. I pushed forward, determined to reach the ridge before I stopped. It was late when I realized I had made a mistake. The trail had thinned to almost nothing. I came to a fork, not marked on my map. One path led up into rocks and thicker trees, the other curved downward into shadow. I hesitated, studied the ground, and thought I saw faint signs of old boot prints leading upward. I chose that way, pushing through brush, scraping my arms on branches, climbing over rocks. The path kept climbing, but it didn't open up. It grew harder, steeper, twisting in directions that didn't match the map. I stopped, checked my compass again, and felt a twist in my stomach. I was off course. By then, the sun had dipped behind the ridge. Shadows stretched long. The air cooled fast. I thought about turning back, but the path was so tangled I wasn't sure I could follow it down in fading light. I pulled out my headlamp, adjusted the strap, and kept climbing, hoping to break out onto the ridge and reorient myself. The ground grew rough. Rocks slid under my boots. The slope tilted so sharply that I had to brace with my hands. My pack dragged at me. I slipped more than once, catching myself on branches. My breath came hard, and my chest ached with the effort. By the time I reached what looked like a small clearing, it was nearly dark. The sky above was a narrow strip of deep blue fading to black. Trees loomed on all sides. I knew I wasn't anywhere near the ridge. I had climbed too far into a section not even marked on the map. I set down my pack, my hands shaking, and pulled out my tent. The ground was uneven, rocky, but I didn't have the strength to keep moving. I pitched the tent clumsily, ate a handful of trail mix, and crawled inside. The forest at night was not silent. Every few minutes I heard something moving, the crack of a branch, the rustle of leaves, sometimes close, sometimes far. My heart pounded with every sound. I lay still, clutching my knife, staring at the roof of the tent. Hours dragged. Sleep came in short, restless bursts, broken by sudden jolts awake when something snapped outside. When dawn finally came, pale and weak through the trees, I felt drained. I forced myself up, packed, and tried to retrace my steps. But the trail was gone. Where I thought I had climbed the day before, there was nothing but brush and rock. I pushed through, searching for the way down, but every direction looked the same. Panic crept in. I forced myself to breathe, to think. I checked my compass, tried to follow north, hoping it would lead me back toward the main trail. I hiked for hours, stumbling, pushing through thick growth. My arms and legs were cut and bruised. My water ran low. The day stretched on, endless. The forest seemed to twist around me, every tree looking like the last. I tried to mark my path, scratching bark, piling stones, but soon I was lost in circles. I passed the same fallen log twice, though I could have sworn I was walking straight. By late afternoon, thirst burned in my throat. I searched desperately for water. Finally, I heard the faint trickle of a stream. Relief surged through me. I dropped to my knees, filled my bottle, drank deeply, and forced myself to keep going. But the sun sank again, and I was still lost. I set up camp in another small clearing, ate the last of my jerky, and lay awake listening to the forest move around me. My fear had grown dull, replaced with a cold, heavy dread. On the third day, exhaustion set in. My body ached, blisters burned on my feet, my stomach cramped with hunger. I moved slower every step in effort. I thought of home, of the safety of my bed, of how far away that felt now. I saw no one, no trails, no sign of people at all. Just endless trees and rocks and silence broken by the sound of my own struggling breath. By the fourth day, I was barely moving. I drank from streams, ate what little I could forage. Berries I prayed weren't poisonous, a handful of roots. My vision blurred, my thoughts scattered. It was late afternoon when I finally stumbled onto something that didn't belong to the wilderness. A strip of orange flagging tape hung from a branch. My heart pounded. I followed it, and then I saw another and another. They led down through the trees, and after what felt like hours, I broke onto a dirt road. I collapsed to my knees, tears blurring my vision. The road was old, rutted, but it was human. It meant safety. I followed it, dragging my body forward, until at last I heard the sound of a truck engine. The driver stopped when he saw me. I must have looked half dead, filthy, scratched, barely able to stand. He gave me water, food, and drove me back to the nearest ranger station. I learned later I had gone miles off the marked trail, into an uncharted section of forest where old logging paths twisted into nothing. People had been lost there before. Some had never come out. I made it out, but the memory stayed. The endless trees, the hunger, the sound of branches breaking in the dark when I was alone in my tent. It all stayed with me. I had gone looking for challenge, for adventure. What I found was how quickly the wilderness could strip me down to nothing, how fragile I really was against its weight. I went hiking alone last summer in the mountains of northern Montana. I had been hiking for years, and I thought I had enough experience to handle myself in the backcountry. I wanted to do a 4-day loop through a section of wilderness that wasn't very well known. It was the kind of area where you could go days without seeing another person. That was exactly what I was looking for, because I wanted peace and space. I carried all the usual gear: tent, sleeping bag, food, stove, bear spray, map, compass, and an emergency beacon. I thought I was prepared for everything. The trail started out easy. It wound through a valley of tall grass and thin forest, with the sound of a stream running alongside it. The first day felt like a warm-up. The air was clear, the sun was strong but not too hot, and I moved at a steady pace. I stopped often to drink water and check my bearings. I kept my map in a waterproof case around my neck, and every time the trail bent or split, I made sure I knew exactly where I was. That first night, I camped near the stream, cooked a simple meal, and slept well. On the second day, the land changed. The trail climbed higher and the trees grew thick. The ground was uneven, with roots twisting everywhere, and I had to slow down. I could feel the weight of my pack pressing harder into my shoulders. I sweated so much that my shirt clung to me like a wet rag. The sound of birds was less frequent, and instead there were long stretches of silence broken only by the crunch of my boots and my own breathing. I didn't see a single other hiker all day. That silence felt different than the quiet of the first day. It was heavier, as if the forest itself was watching. I pushed through the dense trees and reached a ridge late in the afternoon. The view opened up into a wide valley below, green with pine and cut by a winding river. I sat for a while, ate some trail mix, and studied the map. According to it, the trail would drop into the valley, then swing around the mountains and connect back to where I started in a few days. Everything looked straightforward. I packed up and started moving again, but as I descended, the trail became faint. Grass covered the path in places, and fallen branches forced me to climb over or detour around them. I had to pay attention to every step. That night, I camped on a flat patch near the bottom of the valley. I collected water from the river, filtered it, and cooked noodles on my little stove. By then I was tired, but I forced myself to hang my food in a tree far from where I slept. Bears were always on my mind in this part of the country. After cleaning up, I crawled into my tent. The sky outside darkened fast, and I heard the wind move through the trees. At one point during the night, I thought I heard movement close by. Leaves crunching, something shifting. My pulse spiked, and I sat up, listening hard. I held my bear spray in my hand and waited. The sound came once, then stopped. Could have been a deer, could have been nothing. I stayed awake for an hour before I finally let myself fall back to sleep. The third day was where everything started to change. When I woke, the air felt colder, heavier. Clouds hung low, and light rain began falling not long after I started walking. The trail here was almost gone. I followed what I thought were faint markers, but soon I wasn't sure anymore. Every tree looked the same. I checked my compass often, but the rain blurred my map, and I had to stop under trees to wipe it off. I told myself I was still going the right way, but a creeping feeling in my stomach said otherwise. By midday, the rain came harder. My clothes were soaked, my boots squished with every step, and the trail had disappeared completely. I had no choice but to keep moving forward, hoping I'd reconnect with it. The forest felt endless, a tangle of trunks and shadows. I climbed over fallen logs, slid down muddy slopes, and cut through brush so thick it scratched my arms. Hours passed, and I realized I was lost. My chest tightened as the thought sank in. I stopped to calm myself, set my pack down, and pulled out the map again. My hands shook as I traced the lines, trying to guess where I was. Nothing matched. The river I expected wasn't there. The ridge line didn't look right, and I couldn't even hear water anymore. All I heard was the rain hitting leaves. Panic pressed on me, but I forced myself to breathe. I marked a direction with my compass, telling myself I'd stick to it. At least then I wouldn't wander in circles. The rain made the ground soft, and my boots slid on the slopes. At one point, I slipped and fell hard onto my side. My pack cushioned me, but my hip ached. I lay there in the mud for a while, staring up at the gray sky through the trees, feeling the rain on my face. For the first time, I thought about turning on my emergency beacon, but I hesitated, felt too soon. I still had food, water, and energy. Rescue was supposed to be the last option. I convinced myself to keep going. By late afternoon, I found what looked like an old trail. It was narrow and overgrown, but it was at least a path. I followed it with renewed hope, though every step was slower because my body ached. My shoulders burned from the weight of the pack, my hip throbbed from the fall, and my feet were blistered. I walked until the light faded, then forced myself to set up camp. The ground was uneven and wet, but I was too tired to search for better. I pitched the tent, crawled inside, and shivered as I stripped off wet clothes. My sleeping bag was damp, but it was the only warmth I had. That night was the longest of my life. The forest was alive with sounds. Branches cracked, leaves rustled, and once I heard a low grunt that made my blood run cold. My bear spray stayed in my hand again. I barely slept, drifting in and out of shallow, nervous rest. Every time I closed my eyes, I pictured animals moving in the dark, creeping closer. When morning finally came, I felt weak but relieved. The rain had stopped, but the forest was dripping. I packed slowly, every movement stiff. I kept following the faint trail, but soon it faded again into nothing. By now, my food was running low, and I felt my body start to resist me. I forced myself to keep moving, knowing that stopping meant danger. The next 2 days blurred together. I moved through forest, over ridges, across streams. Sometimes I thought I saw signs of human presence. An old fire ring, a cut log, boot prints, but I could never be sure. My mind played tricks on me. Hunger gnawed at me, and my lips cracked from thirst when I rationed water too tightly. My blisters burst and bled, and every step was agony. The silence pressed down harder. The feeling of being utterly alone grew heavier with every mile. On the 5th morning, I reached a slope that looked familiar. I thought I recognized the shape of the ridge from my map. I pushed myself harder, fueled by the idea that I might finally be close to the loop trail. But the slope was steep, and the ground gave way beneath me. I slipped again, this time tumbling down. My pack twisted me, and I landed hard on rocks. Pain exploded in my leg. I screamed, but the sound vanished into the trees. I tried to stand, but my ankle gave out instantly. Swelling started right away, and I knew I couldn't keep walking. Panic hit me again, stronger this time. The wilderness didn't care that I was hurt. The wilderness didn't care about me at all. I crawled back to where my pack had landed, dragged it close, and sat shaking. For a long time, I just sat there, staring at the forest, realizing how bad it was. I ate the last of my food that night. The sky cleared, and stars shone bright through the trees. I thought about my family, about the decision to hike alone, about how stupid it was to push myself this deep into unfamiliar ground. My body ached everywhere, and every sound in the night seemed sharper, more threatening. By the 6th morning, I couldn't deny it. I needed rescue. With trembling hands, I pulled out the emergency beacon. I stared at it for a long time, afraid of pressing the button, afraid of admitting that I had failed, afraid of the cost and embarrassment. But then I thought about the reality of not pressing it. Days more without food, no way to walk, predators nearby. I pressed it. The light blinked red, then green. The signal was out. I waited all day, nerves on edge. Every gust of wind made me turn. Every sound made me tighten my grip on the bear spray. Hours passed with no sign of anything. I wondered if the signal even worked under the thick canopy. I thought about pressing it again just to be sure. Then, late in the afternoon, I heard something different. The sound of a helicopter. Started faint, then grew louder. I dragged myself into an open patch, waving my arms even though I knew they couldn't see me under the trees. Minutes later, the sound faded, then grew again, circling. Finally, it came close enough that I knew they had me. A rescuer dropped down through the trees. Relief hit me so hard I almost sobbed. They gave me water, checked my ankle, and called for a lift. I was airlifted out of that forest. I had been hiking for years, but I had never done anything that really pushed me close to my limit. Most of my trips were well-marked trails, places with maps and signs, spots where other people passed by from time to time. I wanted something harder, something more quiet, more isolated. When I started reading about some forgotten trails in the backcountry that weren't on the main park maps anymore, I knew that was the kind of thing I wanted to try. That's how I ended up planning a long solo hike deep into an area I wasn't completely familiar with. I had all the usual gear with me: a heavy backpack, sleeping bag, tent, food for several days, a small camp stove, 2 bottles for water, a filter, and layers of clothing. I also had a printed topographic map and a compass. I felt confident. I had trained for years, and even though I knew the trail wasn't popular anymore, I believed I could handle it. The first day started fine. The weather was clear, the air cool, and the forest was alive with sounds of birds. The path began wide and easy to follow, though it gradually narrowed the further I went. The trees were tall and thick, blocking out most of the sunlight. I liked the feeling of being so deep in it, away from traffic, away from people. By late afternoon, I had covered a good distance. I set up camp near a small stream that ran down from the mountains. I boiled water, ate a dehydrated meal, and sat on a rock watching the light fade. Everything felt peaceful. The second day was tougher. The trail became harder to see, overgrown with brush and roots. Some sections were blocked with fallen trees that forced me to climb over or around. Still, I pushed on. The deeper I went, the fewer signs there were of anyone else ever being there. The trail itself looked more like faint game paths than something people used. By the afternoon, clouds started to gather. A light drizzle began, soaking the ground. My boots slipped in mud, and progress slowed. When I checked the map, I realized I had misjudged how far the next water source was. I had enough for the night, but it meant I had to ration until I found another stream. That night, I camped in a small clearing surrounded by pines. The rain grew heavier. The sound of it hitting the tent fabric kept me awake. I tried not to think about how alone I was out there. No one else knew this trail well, and I hadn't passed a single hiker since leaving the start. I forced myself to sleep. The third day was when things began to unravel. I woke to thick fog rolling through the trees. Visibility was barely 20 feet. The trail, already faint, almost disappeared in the mist. I tried to follow what looked like the right way using the compass and map, but I quickly lost confidence. Branches clawed at my jacket. My boots sank into moss and mud. Hours passed, and the fog didn't lift. I found myself circling back to places that looked the same. The terrain didn't match what I saw on the map. Instead of a ridge I should have reached, I was in a deep gully with slick rocks. My pace slowed to a crawl. The air felt heavy, damp, pressing in from all sides. By midday, I slipped on a muddy slope and fell hard. My pack slammed into me as I hit the ground. Pain shot through my hip, but nothing felt broken. Still, it rattled me. I sat there for a long time, mud soaking into my clothes, realizing how bad it could get if I seriously injured myself. I forced myself back up and kept moving, but now every sound made me uneasy. I could hear branches cracking somewhere far off. Maybe it was deer, maybe something else. In thick fog, you can't tell how far things are. Every sound feels closer than it is. When I finally found a small flat area, I decided to stop early. I was soaked, chilled, and tired. My hands shook as I set up the tent. I boiled a little water for food, but my appetite was gone. I crawled into the sleeping bag and lay awake for hours, listening. During the night, something moved near my camp. I froze inside the tent. At first, I thought it was just wind or rain, but then I heard the soft crunch of footsteps on wet ground. They circled slowly. I held my breath. My knife was in the pack outside, and I had nothing inside but a small flashlight. The steps stopped for a while, then continued, fading away. I didn't sleep much after that. The next morning, the fog thinned slightly, but not enough to see far. I packed up and tried again to orient myself. My compass said I had been drifting west, away from where I thought I was going. I adjusted, heading north, hoping to intersect the ridge line. Hours later, instead of a ridge, I found a marshy area. The ground was soft and black, sucking at my boots. Reeds grew tall, and mosquitoes swarmed around my face. I knew I had gone too far off course. My map didn't show any marshes in that section. That meant I was lost. Panic hit me then, not sharp and sudden, but slow, heavy, crawling under my skin. I kept trying to push forward, hoping to find higher ground. Every few minutes, I had to stop and pull my boots out of sucking mud. My legs grew tired, my back ached, and my water supply was running low. When I finally reached a patch of firmer ground, I dropped the pack and sat down. My clothes were soaked with sweat and rain. My stomach growled, but I didn't want to eat. The idea of staying another night out there without knowing where I was made me sick. I decided I needed to backtrack. Even if it took days, I had to retrace my steps until I found the last place I was sure of. The problem was that fog, rain, and marsh had erased most of my tracks. Every direction looked the same. Endless trees, endless mud. That night, I camped in a small hollow surrounded by trees. I barely set up the tent before the rain came again. The ground beneath the tent turned to soft mud, and water pooled at the edges. My sleeping bag grew damp. Every noise outside made me jolt awake. Something snapped branches in the dark. Something splashed in the mud nearby. I kept the flashlight clutched in my hand, but I never saw anything. On the 5th day, exhaustion set in. My legs trembled as I walked. My stomach ached with hunger. I forced myself to eat one small meal, but it didn't feel like enough. My water was almost gone. Around midday, I saw a faint trail that looked like it had once been cut by people. It was barely there, covered in roots and moss, but it was something. I followed it, heart pounding. It led uphill through thicker forest, then curved along a steep slope. At times, the ground dropped off sharply to one side. If I slipped, I would fall far. The trail narrowed until it was little more than a ledge. I had to press against the rock wall, inching along. My pack scraped the stone. My hands clutched at wet roots for balance. Below was nothing but fog. My heart raced, sweat stinging my eyes. One wrong step and I'd be gone. I made it across, shaking, and kept moving. Hours later, I realized the trail was fading again. It ended at a small landslide where rock and dirt had collapsed long ago. Beyond that was nothing but thick brush. I stood there for a long time, staring. My legs felt hollow. I wanted to scream, but no sound came. The trail I thought would save me had just ended. By evening, I found another flat patch to camp. My body ached so badly that I collapsed inside the tent without eating. I dreamed of water, of wide open roads, of safety. The 6th day was worse. I woke weak, barely able to stand. My lips were cracked from thirst. I stumbled downhill, hoping to find a stream. After hours of crashing through undergrowth, I finally heard the faint trickle of water. I dropped to my knees and used the filter to drink until my stomach cramped. But I was still lost. I decided then that I couldn't keep wandering blindly. I needed to stay put and make myself visible. I cleared a small area, built a fire, and tried to keep smoke rising. But the forest was so damp the fire barely caught. Wet smoke curled low and faded quickly. Days blurred together. I tried climbing small rises to look for any sign of a ridge or open sky, but fog and trees blocked everything. Food ran low. I ate in small portions, stretching it out, but I knew it wouldn't last. Nights were the worst. Something always moved in the dark. Sometimes it was the distant cry of animals. Sometimes it was closer, snapping twigs, heavy breathing, soft movement in the wet ground. I never saw what it was. Maybe it was deer. Maybe it wasn't. The fear made me too scared to sleep. By the 10th day, I was running on nothing but instinct. My body felt hollow, my thoughts dull. I staggered through the forest like a drunk, clutching the straps of my pack. My clothes were torn, my skin covered in cuts and bruises. That afternoon, I stumbled out onto a faint dirt road. At first, I thought I was hallucinating. The road was overgrown with weeds, barely visible, but it was there. I dropped to my knees, hands in the dirt, laughing without sound. I followed it for hours. It twisted through the trees, sometimes fading, sometimes clear. As night I had been planning the trip for weeks. The idea was simple. I wanted to spend a long weekend hiking through a remote canyon area that I had read about in a guidebook. It wasn't part of a popular national park, but rather a piece of public land that stretched for miles with deep canyons, high ridges, and very few people. The guidebook described it as rugged, lonely, and not marked with many official trails. That was exactly what drew me to it. I wanted something quiet, away from crowds, where I could push myself physically and get the kind of solitude that you only find far from everything. I packed light but made sure to bring the essentials. My backpack had a small tent, sleeping bag, water filter, stove, food for 3 days, extra layers, a paper map, and a compass. I also had my phone, though I knew there would be no service once I entered the canyons. I carried 3 liters of water to start because the guidebook mentioned that while there were streams in the canyons, they weren't always reliable. I felt confident. I had done multi-day hikes before, though not in terrain this wild. The first morning was hot even before I parked my car on the dirt road near the entrance to the canyon system. The sky was cloudless, and the air shimmered above the baked ground. I locked the car, shouldered my pack, and walked down toward the narrow wash that marked the start of my route. The plan was to follow one canyon for about 12 miles, then climb up to a ridge and descend another canyon on the far side, eventually looping back toward where my car was parked. According to the map, it should take 3 days if I paced myself and didn't linger too much. The first miles were easy enough. The canyon was wide and shallow at the start, the walls only about 30 feet high, sloping gently upward with scattered brush and a few stunted trees. I walked on soft sand, my boots sinking slightly with each step. There were animal tracks, mostly deer or coyote, and once I saw the wide pads of what looked like a mountain lion. The sun climbed higher and the heat settled into the canyon. The walls grew taller, the space narrower, and soon I was in shadow, which gave me some relief. I stopped mid-morning to drink water and study the map. The guidebook said that some side canyons branched off in confusing ways, and it was easy to take a wrong turn. I made a habit of looking back often, trying to memorize landmarks so I would recognize them on the return. The walls of the canyon shifted from light brown to deep red as the day wore on, and I began to feel the weight of solitude pressing on me. There was no sound except the crunch of my boots and the occasional call of a bird high above. By early afternoon, the canyon narrowed so much that I had to turn sideways in places to squeeze through. The walls rose hundreds of feet, straight up, cutting off the sky. It was cooler there but also darker, and I began to feel a sense of being trapped. I had read about flash floods in such canyons, and though the sky was still perfectly clear, the thought of water rushing through this narrow slot made my stomach tighten. I tried to shake it off and focus on my steps. I made camp that night in a wider section where the canyon opened up into a sandy flat with a few boulders. I pitched my tent, cooked a simple meal of rice and dried vegetables, and sat quietly as the light faded. The silence was overwhelming. At first it felt peaceful, then strangely unsettling. There was no distant hum of cars, no voices, nothing but the faint rustle of wind against the rocks. When night fully fell, the darkness was absolute. The walls of the canyon blocked much of the starlight. Inside my tent, I felt as though I was buried deep underground. Sleep came in short stretches. I woke often, listening. Sometimes I thought I heard footsteps, though I knew it was probably just rocks settling or animals moving in the distance. Every sound seemed magnified. My heart raced at small things, but eventually exhaustion pulled me back under. The next morning, I packed up and continued deeper. According to the map, I needed to climb out of the main canyon later that day to cross a ridge. The climb wasn't supposed to be technical, just a steep scramble up loose rock. I moved carefully, sweating in the heat, using both hands to steady myself. My pack felt heavier than before, dragging me backward. Every time I stopped to catch my breath, I felt the silence pressing in again, as if the whole landscape was holding itself still. At the top, I paused to look around. The view stretched for miles. Red cliffs, jagged ridges, and dry washes cut the earth into a maze. It was beautiful but intimidating. I could see how easy it would be to get lost. Everything looked the same, and the map in my hand suddenly felt inadequate compared to the endless shapes in front of me. Still, I pushed on, crossing the ridge and starting down into the next canyon. The descent was rough. Loose gravel slid under my boots, and more than once I nearly fell. When I finally reached the bottom, I found the canyon floor was choked with boulders. I had to climb, squeeze, and sometimes slide to get through. It was slow going, and my legs ached from the constant effort. I checked my water bottles often. The guidebook had mentioned a spring in this canyon, but when I reached the spot marked on the map, I found nothing but dry rock. Panic stirred in me then. I still had water, but not much. I told myself the spring could just be farther down, or maybe I would find a pool from recent rains. Still, the uncertainty gnawed at me. I rationed my sips, wetting my mouth rather than drinking deeply. My throat felt dry, and my lips cracked in the heat. As the day dragged on, I realized I was moving slower than planned. The terrain was harder than the book had made it sound. The obstacles wore me down. I began to wonder if I had bitten off more than I could handle. By the time the sun started dipping low, I was still miles from where I intended to camp. I forced myself to keep going, stumbling on tired legs, my pack digging into my shoulders. When I finally found a flat patch big enough for my tent, it was nearly dark. I dropped my pack and sat for a long time, breathing hard. My body ached everywhere. I cooked a small meal but barely ate half of it. My stomach felt knotted from stress. I lay in my tent staring at the ceiling, too wired to sleep. My thoughts kept circling back to the empty spring, the dwindling water, and the endless canyons ahead. That night was worse than the first. I woke over and over, convinced I heard noises outside the tent. At one point, I thought I saw a shadow move across the fabric, but when I sat up and unzipped the door, there was nothing but blackness. My nerves were raw. Every instinct told me I was too far out, too vulnerable. The next morning, I made a decision. Instead of continuing the loop as planned, I would cut my trip short and try to make my way back to the car. I told myself it was the smart choice. With limited water and no reliable sources ahead, pushing deeper would be reckless. But finding my way back proved harder than I expected. The canyons twisted in confusing patterns. Side washes branched off unexpectedly, and more than once I had to backtrack when I realized I had gone the wrong way. The sun climbed higher, burning down on me, and my water supply dwindled fast. By midday, I was down to my last liter. My mouth felt like sandpaper. I tried not to panic, but the edges of fear crept in. My pace slowed, my legs heavy, every step harder than the last. Then I made a mistake. I tried to shortcut over a ridge rather than follow the canyon's long curve. The climb was brutal, the sun unrelenting, and when I reached the top, I realized I had no idea where I was. The landmarks I thought I recognized were gone. Every direction looked the same. My map felt useless in my trembling hands. I felt the first real wave of panic then, sharp and suffocating. I told myself to breathe, to stay calm, but my heart pounded. I had less than a half liter of water left, no spring in sight, and no clear idea which way led back. The hours that followed blurred together. I wandered, trying to match the map to the ridges, but nothing lined up. My head throbbed, my lips bled from dryness. I stopped sweating, which scared me more than anything else. I knew that meant dehydration was setting in fast. As the sun dropped, I stumbled down into a canyon, hoping desperately to find even a puddle. I scraped my knees on rocks, my hands raw from grabbing for balance. At the bottom, I found only more dry sand and stone. I dropped my pack and sat down hard, fighting the urge to give up. Night fell again, and I lay on the bare ground without setting up my tent. I was too exhausted. My body shook with thirst. My tongue felt swollen. I couldn't think straight. I drifted in and out of shallow sleep, my dreams filled with rushing water that vanished when I reached for it. Morning came and I forced myself up. My bottle was nearly empty, just a few warm sips sloshing at the bottom. I knew I had to keep moving, but every step felt like dragging a dead weight. I followed the canyon downward, reasoning that sooner or later water had to collect somewhere. Hours passed. My vision blurred. My legs buckled beneath me more than once. I licked my cracked lips, tasting only blood. My